I stood frozen on my back porch, coffee mug suspended halfway to my mouth as I tried to process the scene unfolding in my backyard. White folding chairs arranged in perfect rows, a flower-adorned arch standing proudly at the end of a makeshift aisle, a string quartet setting up in the corner tuning their instruments with practiced precision, and caterers, actual professional caterers arranging elaborate hors d'oeuvres on white cloth tables. I blinked hard, wondering if I was still dreaming. This had to be some kind of bizarre hallucination, because there was absolutely no way someone had set up an entire wedding venue in my backyard without my knowledge or permission. But as I watched elegantly dressed guests begin to arrive, clutching gift boxes wrapped in silver paper and taking seats in those pristine white chairs, reality sank in. This was happening, on my property, right now, and I had a pretty good idea who was behind it. My gaze drifted to the pasture gate where my 4 cows, Buttercup, Daisy, Clover, and Ferdinand, were watching the commotion with equal curiosity, their large brown eyes taking in the spectacle. A slow smile spread across my face as an idea formed. I set down my coffee mug, walked down the porch steps, and made my way toward the pasture gate. The metal latch was cool under my fingers as I pulled it open with a satisfying click. "Ladies and gentlemen," I murmured to my bovine audience, "I believe you have a party to attend." With surprising enthusiasm, my cows trotted out, heading straight for the tables loaded with fancy finger foods and elaborate floral centerpieces. I never planned on having problems with neighbors when I purchased this property 5 years ago. 10 acres of beautiful pasture land with a modest but comfortable farmhouse. It was everything I wanted. Room for my small hobby farm, peace and quiet, and enough distance from the city to see stars at night. The fact that my land happened to border the eastern edge of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association was a detail I hadn't worried much about. My property wasn't within their jurisdiction. I made certain of that before signing the papers. The real estate agent had been very clear about the boundary lines, even showing me the survey markers that delineated where my land ended and the affluent suburban community began. "You won't have to worry about those home owners association types," she assured me. "Your property is completely independent. They can't tell you what color to paint your mailbox or whether you can put up a fence." That had been a selling point for me. After years of apartment living in the city, answering to landlords and building managers, the thought of having complete autonomy over my own piece of land was intoxicating. I could build, plant, and raise whatever I wanted, within reason and county regulations, of course. I'd always dreamed of a small hobby farm, nothing commercial or overwhelming, just enough to be self-sustainable and connected to the rhythms of the natural world. The previous owner had installed a sturdy barn that needed minimal repairs, and the fenced pasture was in excellent condition. Within months of moving in, I had added my first 2 Highland cows, Buttercup and Daisy, purchased from a retiring farmer 2 counties over. They were followed a year later by Clover and Ferdinand, completing my small herd. I kept to myself, tended my garden, and cared for my gentle, shaggy creatures that produced excellent milk and were more like pets than livestock. Their long, russet-colored fur and sweeping horns might have looked intimidating to the uninitiated, but anyone who spent 5 minutes with them quickly realized they had the temperament of oversized puppies, curious, affectionate, and utterly harmless unless... Karen Whitfield, however, took immediate issue with my rural lifestyle. As the self-purported queen of the Homeowners Association, she believed her authority extended well beyond the actual boundaries of Meadowbrook Estates. From the first week I moved in, she made her displeasure known. "Those animals are an eyesore," she informed me during her uninvited first visit to my property. Her nose wrinkled as if she'd smelled something unpleasant. "This is an upscaled community. We have standards to maintain." I politely explained that my property wasn't part of her homeowners association, showed her the clearly marked boundary, and thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Karen was the epitome of the suburban elite, a woman in her early 50s with immaculately maintained blonde hair, a wardrobe that rotated through designer labels with military precision, and the kind of tan that suggested regular appointments rather than actual outdoor activity. Her husband, a corporate attorney I rarely saw, had apparently provided her with enough financial security that she didn't need to work. Instead, she channeled her considerable energy into micromanaging the affairs of Meadowbrook Estates, from the acceptable height of garden gnomes to the precise shade of beige permitted for exterior paint. What began as occasional visits to my property soon evolved into a systematic campaign. She would park her luxury SUV at the edge of my driveway and march up to my door with clipboard in hand as though conducting an official inspection. Over the years, Karen's complaints became a regular occurrence. My fence was unsightly, the occasional mooing disturbed her garden parties. The smell, though my property was kept immaculately clean, was simply unbearable when the wind blew in her direction. "Have you considered boarding your animals elsewhere?" she suggested during one particularly tense encounter. "The Hendersons 2 streets over are considering selling their home because of the constant disruption. Property values, you understand." I didn't bother pointing out that the Hendersons lived well within the homeowners association boundaries and couldn't possibly see or smell my farm from their location. Logic, I had learned, was not Karen's strong suit when she was on a mission. "My animals are well within county regulations," I replied calmly, "and since my property isn't part of Meadowbrook Estates, your homeowners association regulations don't apply here." She left in a huff that day but was back the following week with complaints about my compost pile, which she claimed was visible from the community walking path, a path that came nowhere near my property line. I did my best to stay cordial while firmly holding my ground. I installed additional trees along the property line to create a visual barrier between my farm and the nearest Meadowbrook homes. I made sure my pastures were immaculately maintained, the fence freshly painted, the animals well groomed. Not because Karen demanded it, but because I took pride in my small farm and didn't want to give her legitimate grounds for complaint. Meanwhile, Karen's social standing in the community grew, as did the extravagance of her gatherings. Garden parties became charity galas, barbecues transformed into catered affairs, with valet parking. The quiet suburban streets would suddenly fill with luxury vehicles as the social elite of 3 counties descended upon Meadowbrook Estates. Each event seemed designed to showcase her importance, with my farm serving as an irritating backdrop she couldn't quite eliminate. Sometimes I would catch her leading groups of expensively dressed guests along the walking path nearest my property, gesturing in my direction with obvious disapproval, as though my peaceful little farm was a blight on her perfect suburban paradise. The wedding situation began exactly 1 week before the chaos. I was repairing a section of fence when Karen's luxury SUV pulled into my driveway. She approached with that familiar plastic smile, designer sunglasses perched on her perfectly highlighted hair. "Good afternoon, neighbor," she called with false cheer that immediately put me on edge. Experience had taught me that Karen was only this pleasant when she wanted something. I nodded politely, hammer still in hand. "Karen, what can I do for you today?" She adjusted her sunglasses, the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist catching the sunlight. "I'm just here to give you a courtesy notice. Next Saturday we'll be using the common green space behind your property for my niece's wedding. I wanted to let you know so you could keep those animals of yours contained and quiet for the day." I frowned, setting down my hammer. "Common green space? Karen, there is no common space back there. That's my yard. It's part of my property deed." She laughed. A short, dismissive sound. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. That area has always been designated for community use. The Homeowners Association approved the venue last month." I felt my patience wearing thin. "The Homeowners Association has no authority over my property. I'm not a member, and my land isn't within your jurisdiction. That's my private backyard, and I didn't approve any wedding." Karen's smile tightened. "It's just for 1 day. Surely you can be reasonable about this. My niece has her heart set on an outdoor country wedding, and your backdrop actually works with her rustic theme." The audacity of her statement left me momentarily speechless. When I found my voice, it was calm but firm. "Karen, I am absolutely not giving permission for anyone to hold a wedding on my property. If I see any wedding preparations in my yard, I will consider it trespassing. Am I making myself clear?" She stared at me for a long moment, then turned on her heel without another word. As she climbed back into her SUV, I had the distinct feeling this conversation was far from over. The day of the wedding, I had to run into town for feed supplies. I left early, planning to be back well before any potential confrontation with Karen. I had my doubts that she would actually follow through with her outrageous plan, but I wasn't taking any chances. I made arrangements with my neighbor, old Mr. Jenkins, to keep an eye on my property while I was gone. He lived on the other side of my farm, well away from Meadowbrook Estates, and had his own issues with Karen after she had attempted to report his antique tractor collection as an eyesore to the county commissioners last year. "Don't you worry," he assured me, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "I'll call you if that woman shows up with so much as a folding chair." I thanked him, climbed into my truck, and headed into town. The local feed store was having a sale on the organic grain mix my cows preferred, and I planned to stock up. I also needed to pick up some medications from the vet for Ferdinand, who had been showing early signs of an eye infection the day before. The trip should have taken 3 hours at most, 90 minutes of driving round trip, plus time for my errands. I had planned to be back by noon, giving me plenty of time to deal with any potential wedding preparations. But fate had other plans. A semi-truck carrying industrial equipment had overturned on the main highway back to my property, blocking all lanes. Traffic was diverted onto small country roads ill-equipped to handle the volume, creating a snaking line of vehicles crawling along at a fraction of the normal speed. My phone rang as I sat in the barely moving traffic. It was Mr. Jenkins, his voice tight with urgency. "They're here," he said without preamble. "Trucks started arriving about an hour ago. Caterers, florists, some kind of rental company with chairs and tables, a whole army of them. I tried to tell them they were on private property, but some woman in a blue dress told me to mind my own business. Karen, of course." I thanked Mr. Jenkins for the warning and assured him I was on my way, though given the current traffic situation, that wasn't entirely truthful. By the time I finally pulled into my driveway, it was mid-afternoon and my jaw dropped at the sight that greeted me. Cars lined both sides of the road for nearly half a mile. A small tent city had been erected in my backyard. White chairs, flower arrangements, an actual red carpet rolled out across my lawn, and people, dozens of people in formal attire, milling about with champagne flutes in hand. A string quartet played softly in the corner nearest my house, their classical melodies drifting across what had been, just that morning, a peaceful stretch of grass where my cows sometimes grazed. For a moment I sat in my truck, stunned by the sheer audacity. The scale of Karen's trespass was breathtaking. This wasn't just setting up a few chairs for a quick ceremony. This was a full-scale professional wedding venue, constructed without permission on my private property. I could see catering staff moving efficiently among the crowd with trays of appetizers. A bar had been set up under a white canopy. There was even a dance floor, an actual wooden dance floor laid directly over my grass. Then anger took over, hot and clarifying. I stormed across my property, ignoring the curious glances from guests who clearly had no idea they were trespassing. Several people smiled and nodded as I passed, clearly assuming I was just another latecomer to the festivities. A young man in a tuxedo actually offered me a glass of champagne, which I declined with a curt shake of my head. I spotted Karen immediately, resplendent in a pale blue dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, directing a photographer on the best angles to capture the ceremony. She was in her element, gesturing grandly at the pastoral backdrop, my pasture, while pointing out specific shots she wanted. "Make sure you get the mountains in the background," she was saying, "and perhaps a few with that rustic old barn. It's all part of the countryside aesthetic we're going for." "Karen," I called, loud enough that several nearby guests turned to stare. "What do you think you're doing?" She turned, her expression momentarily faltering before the plastic smile snapped back into place. "Oh, there you are. Isn't it beautiful? Melissa will be so pleased you made it back in time for the ceremony. It's starting in 20 minutes. She spoke as if we had agreed to this, as if I had somehow consented to having my private property transformed into Wedding Central without my knowledge. "Karen," I said through gritted teeth, keeping my voice low to avoid causing a scene, "we discussed this last week. This is my property. You have no right to be here. None of you do. This needs to stop right now." She patted my arm condescendingly. "Oh, don't be such a spoilsport. It's just one day. Look how beautiful everything is. And don't worry, we'll clean up afterward. You won't have to do a thing." Before I could respond, she was whisked away by the wedding planner, leaving me standing there, fuming and uncertain how to proceed without ruining what was clearly an important day for people who probably had no idea they were participating in Karen's trespassing scheme. That's when I noticed my cows. They were gathered at the fence line of their pasture, watching the proceedings with evident interest. Buttercup, my oldest and most mischievous, had her head titled in that way that always meant trouble was brewing in her bovine brain. The wedding cake, a towering 5-tier masterpiece, sat on a table not 20 feet from where they stood. The elegant floral arrangements contained roses and lilies, Daisy's favorite unauthorized snacks whenever she managed to find them, and the look in Ferdinand's eyes as he gazed at the white tablecloths was one I recognized all too well. A sense of calm settled over me as I walked toward the pasture gate. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. If Karen insisted on using my property without permission, then she would have to accept all aspects of country living, including its four-legged residents. The metal latch opened with a satisfying click. I swung the gate wide and stepped back. For a moment my cows simply stood there, as if uncertain about this unexpected freedom. Then Buttercup took a tentative step forward, followed by Daisy, then Clover, and finally Ferdinand. Like a small, shaggy army, they moved forward with growing confidence, heading straight for the wedding setup. I leaned against the fence post, arms crossed, and watched as nature took its course. The first scream came from somewhere near the gift table, where Clover had begun enthusiastically investigating a basket of scented soaps, wrapped in tulle. The woman's shriek attracted attention, and suddenly all eyes were on my advancing cattle. Daisy made a beeline for the floral arrangements, pulling a centerpiece from a table with expert precision, sending champagne glasses toppling in the process. Ferdinand, true to form, grabbed the edge of a tablecloth in his teeth and gave it a firm tug, creating a domino effect of toppling hors d'oeuvres, punch bowls, and carefully arranged silverware. But it was Buttercup who truly understood the assignment. With the dignity of a queen approaching her throne, she walked directly to the massive wedding cake, extended her enormous tongue, and took a deliberate lick of the bottom tier's buttercream frosting. Chaos erupted. Guests scattered in every direction, their formal attire suddenly a hindrance as they tried to avoid the 4 curious Highland cattle now thoroughly enjoying their unexpected party invitation. Women in high heels stumbled across the lawn. Men in expensive suits vaulted over chairs. The string quartet abandoned their instruments mid-note, the violin player nearly tripping over her gown in her haste to escape. And through it all, my cows continued their methodical destruction of Karen's perfect wedding venue. Chairs overturned as Ferdinand scratched his back against them. The flower arch collapsed under Clover's investigative nudging. The red carpet became Daisy's personal buffet as she discovered the roses lining its edges were actually quite tasty. And then there was Karen, her face a mask of fury as she stormed toward me, navigating through the pandemonium with surprising agility for someone in 4-inch heels. "What have you done?" she shrieked, her voice rising above the general commotion. "Do you have any idea what this wedding cost? Do you know who these people are? The father of the groom is a judge. I'll have you sued for everything you own." She continued her tirade, threats of lawsuits and homeowners association penalties pouring out between gasps of outrage. I waited until she paused for breath, then pointed calmly to a small metal stake driven into the ground near where we stood. "That's my property marker, Karen. Everything beyond that point belongs to me. I told you last week this wedding wasn't authorized. I warned you what would happen if you trespassed." Her eyes followed my finger to the property marker, then widened as the reality of her situation sank in. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across her features. The first time I had ever seen Karen anything less than absolutely convinced of her own rightness. It was quickly masked by renewed indignation. "But the homeowners association approved this location," she insisted, though her voice had lost some of its conviction. I shook my head slowly. "The homeowners association has no authority here. This is my land. Those guests are trespassing. And my cows? They're just enjoying home field advantage. As if to emphasize my point, Buttercup chose that moment to knock over the remaining tiers of the wedding cake with a gentle nudge of her massive head. The beautiful creation collapsed in slow motion, fondant and buttercream sliding onto the grass in a sugary avalanche. Behind Karen, I could see the bride, presumably her niece, in full wedding regalia, mascara streaming down her face as she watched her perfect day disintegrate. The groom, red-faced with anger, was already stalking toward the parking area, followed by what appeared to be his family, all wearing identical expressions of outrage. Guests continued to flee, some laughing, others cursing, most simply looking shell-shocked by the turn of events. Karen stood silent for a long moment, her perfectly coiffed hair now slightly askew, her designer dress spotted with what looked suspiciously like punch stains. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You'll regret this. I promise you will." Without waiting for my response, she turned and stalked away, phone already pressed to her ear, presumably calling in reinforcements or legal counsel or whatever resources entitled people summon when their plans go awry. I watched her go, then turned my attention back to my cows. "All right, party's over," I called, walking into the decimated wedding venue. "Time to go home." With surprising docility, my four-legged wrecking crew followed me back to their pasture, leaving destruction in their wake. As I latched the gate behind them, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about the ruined wedding, or even about putting Karen in her place. It was about standing my ground, protecting what was mine, and ensuring that boundaries, literal and figurative, were respected. 3 days later, I was surprised to find an official-looking envelope in my mailbox. Given Karen's threats, I expected it might be legal papers of some kind. Instead, it was a copy of a letter sent to Karen from the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. The letterhead was embossed with the community's coat of arms, and the signature at the bottom belonged to Robert Thornton, the Homeowners Association president. The letter was formal but clear. After review of property records and survey markers, the Homeowners Association acknowledged that the wedding venue had indeed been set up on private property, not under their jurisdiction. Karen was being fined for misrepresentation and unauthorized use of the Homeowners Association's name in securing vendors for an event on non-approved property. Furthermore, she was ordered to provide a written apology to the affected property owner, me, within 14 days. The letter detailed how several board members had conducted their own investigation after receiving complaints from wedding guests about the unfortunate bovine incident. They had reviewed the meeting minutes Karen had referenced and found no record of any vote approving the use of land outside Meadowbrook Estates boundaries. They had checked county records and confirmed that the property in question was indeed privately owned and not subject to Homeowners Association governance. The board wishes to express its deepest regrets for this unfortunate misunderstanding, the letter concluded, and to assure you that Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association respects the property rights of all neighboring landowners. I read the letter twice, then laughed out loud, startling Buttercup, who was watching me from the pasture fence. It seemed that even within her precious Homeowners Association, Karen's influence had limits. But the story didn't end there. Apparently one of the wedding guests had captured the entire cow invasion on video. The clip, featuring Buttercup's cake-licking finale, went viral on social media, garnering millions of views and thousands of comments. Local news picked it up, then national outlets. By the end of the week, my phone was ringing constantly with interview requests and, more surprisingly, booking inquiries. It seemed that Wedding Crasher's Bovine Edition had struck a chord with people tired of perfect, cookie-cutter celebrations. 3 different couples wanted to know if they could rent my pasture and my cows for their upcoming weddings. A reality TV producer left a voicemail about a potential series, and a wedding planner from the city emailed about creating an authentic farm experience package, featuring my Highland cattle as guest stars. As I sat on my porch that evening, watching Buttercup, Daisy, Clover, and Ferdinand graze peacefully in their pasture, blissfully unaware of their newfound fame, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. Karen had wanted to use my farm as a rustic backdrop without my permission, Now people were lining up to do the same thing. Only this time, they were asking nicely and offering to pay for the privilege.